Hi, this is Rob Knight from Your Itinerary. I want to invite you to join me and Rick Garrity in the Rocky Mountains this August to explore Colorado's frontier past. We'll shoot trains, ghost towns, and lots of interesting characters along the way. Oh yeah, and the scenery's pretty nice too. Find out more at digitalphotoadventures.com.
Thanks, Rob. And I want to let everyone know that I still have a few openings left for my workshop in Cuba in early November. Just head on over to dougk.com/workshops. Thanks. Hi, it's Doug K. with another episode of All About the Gear. Once again with my good friend Gordon Lang. We always start those shows with good friend. He is my good friend, though. And this time we're going to be taking a look at an evolutionary camera, one that's had a couple of versions before. Came out in January of 2015. This is the Nikon, or shall we say Nikon D5500. Good morning or afternoon, Gordon.
Good day to you, Doug. I find it safer to say that, regardless of where we are. And we do start as friends, and hopefully we won't end as enemies. Yeah, this is the Nikon D5500. I think it's worth having a little discussion about pronunciation before we go any further. Why do Europeans call this company Nikon and Americans call it Nikon?
It must be the Japanese influence, because I think the Japanese call it Nikon, don't they?
I think they call it Nikon.
Oh, there you go.
More of a ni sound.
So what's the answer?
I think the answer is that I keep saying Nikon and you keep saying Nikon, and we pretend that the other one just at some point will give up and start pronouncing it the same way as the other person. So we should just keep pushing our own pronunciations. I've got to keep going with Nikon. I cannot say Nikon.
Okay. All right. I was going to say maybe we should just switch someday and really confuse everybody.
Yeah, that's right. And on that day, we'll start buying Canon Rebels in Europe, and you'll have the EOS 750D.
There we go. There we go. All right, tell us about this. What is this camera? It's been talked about a bit. It's been bandied about. What is this thing?
Okay, this is what I would call an upper entry level DSLR. Although depending on how you define your ranges, you might call it a mid-range DSLR. Either way, it represents a step up from a budget entry level model. And Nikon divides its range at this end in terms of sensors. So this has got an APS-C crop frame sensor, which in Nikon's terminology is a DX format. And Nikon has got three DX ranges at the moment. They have the 3000s at the entry level. They have the 5000s, which is what this is, in between. And they have the 7000s, which are not quite in the traditional sense semi-professional, but certainly approaching that. You'd call them maybe upper mid-range cameras. But they're all DSLRs. And the interesting thing is that all three of those ranges, the current models, all share essentially the same image quality. They all have 24 megapixel APS-C sensors without low pass filters. And we can talk about that a bit more if you like. So in terms of image quality, there's very little to choose between them. And in terms of continuous shooting, there isn't either. But before we go on to the differences in the range, maybe it's worth looking at what's new on the D5500. What do you think?
Yeah. Tell us, what did they upgrade? Because this is the third version.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that this is the successor to the D5300. Nikon skipped the D5400. I don't know if the number 4 is unlucky in Japan or they're trying to realign their ranges. I certainly hope numerically that they do realign their ranges, because it is a little bit confusing, not just for the consumers, but for the journalists as well. In the current range, we have the D5500. And I hope you'll forgive me calling it the D5500 and not the D5500. Would you call it that?
That's fine.
It's a 55, right? It's funny because if they did the D5000, which they did, I would call that a 5000, not a 5000. But yeah, as soon as it's 5100, I call it 5100. I don't know. Tomato, let's call the whole thing off. So in the current range, we've got the D5500. The entry level is the D3300. And the one above this is the D7200. The D7200 is quite recently announced. So that's not going to be replaced anytime soon. It's a shame. I wish they'd just kind of name them all with the same second digit so that we had 35, 55, and 7500, but they don't. So that's the position that we're in. So this replaces the D5300. There's actually very little difference between those two models. If you're watching the video rather than listening to the podcast, and I would urge you to do that from time to time and have a look at Doug's wonderful face and shirts, you would notice, if you're familiar with the older one, that the grip is a little bit deeper on the 5500. Turning to the back, the thumb dial is now exposed. I'm going to try and hold that in front of the camera so you can see that. Here it is. You can see that. You can see the whole wheel in a kind of Sony style. They've gone there. A few of the other buttons have had a bit of a move around, but that's really the physical difference. The biggest difference is that the screen is now touch sensitive. I'm definitely going to talk about that more later because I love touch screens, and I know you do as well, Doug. But in another respect, it's actually gone backwards. The D5300 had a built-in GPS receiver, and that's been removed now on the D5500 because now it would appear that so long as you've got Wi-Fi in these cameras, you should be able to inherit the GPS coordinates from your smartphone, right, using the supplied applications. But unfortunately, it doesn't work very well in Nikon's world. I'm just going to briefly mention the way that works. If you want to tag your images on any of the Nikon cameras at the moment, and this includes even like the D750, if you want to tag your images, you connect the camera to your phone over Wi-Fi. Cool, that's fine. But instead of sending the GPS position, instead of recording a log, which is what most cameras do, and thereby updating lots of pictures at a time on whatever route you took that day, the Nikon app on the phones actually sends your current position. So let's say you took a photo. Let's say I'm going to go to your world, Doug. Let's say you're in San Francisco and you took a lovely picture of, you're on Treasure Island, taking a picture looking back at the city. And but then a couple of hours later, when you're in North Beach, you think, oh, I'm going to tag that photo. I'm gonna tag it with the GPS position. The way you do it is you connect the cameras over Wi-Fi. You would then go for the GPS tagging option, and that's only when you transfer a picture from the camera to the phone. That's when the tagging process takes place. But it tags it with your current position, so it would be a photo from Treasure Island, but it would be a GPS position of North Beach. So really, the only way you can get it to work is to tag it, transfer it to the phone at the location at which you took the picture. So there's little things like that people don't really mention a lot in reviews, but it just doesn't work very well, that GPS tagging process, which makes it all the more painful that they removed the GPS hardware on this model, because ultimately that's easiest of all, rather than doing all this tagging here and there and processing it afterwards. Wouldn't it be much nicer if it was built into the camera? But they're all taking them out, aren't they? All of the manufacturers are taking out the GPS receivers to save money.
Let's take a slight diversion there and talk about GPS, because I happen to love having GPS coordinates of my images, particularly when I'm either doing landscape work and I want to know exactly where I was in some marvelous place, or even in street photography when I'd like to have a record of what street or intersection I was shooting at. I have two Nikon GPS adapters that I've used with big Nikons. One of the problems there is they drain the battery very quickly in terms of the main camera. I've also used systems like you're describing, and they also drain the batteries quite quickly, both in my phone and in the camera, because they're using a relatively constant connection, at least the way I was using it. Well, what I've taken to using now is recording a GPS log in the phone and then merging it with the images in post-production. Now, it sounds painful. The most painful thing is to remember to start the app on your mobile phone, because if you don't start it, then you don't have the log. But what I do is I start a log on the phone. I shoot all day long. The EXIF data is recording a timestamp. Now, of course, the clocks in my camera and my phone are out of sync. So at the end of the day, with the particular app I'm using, I use my camera to take a photograph of a QR code that's on the phone. That QR code contains not only all the data of the log I've recorded, but it also allows me to synchronize, or at least set the offset between my camera's clock and my phone's clock, and that can be resolved in the software. I do that before I bring the stuff into Lightroom. It's been a very good solution, particularly because it's very, very good on batteries. So that's one way of doing it for people who do want it. It's a nice feature. To be honest, I don't miss it on the cameras because of what it did to battery life.
Doug, what was the name of that app that you use? I like the sound of that.
I knew you were going to ask me that. And before the show is over, I'm going to have that for you. That'll keep people listening all the way through to the end.
It's going to keep me listening. I was going to head off, but I'm going to stick around to the end now.
It's a very nice app. But
it does also prove a point, doesn't it? That here we are kind of criticizing, or here I am criticizing as a reviewer, the implementation by the manufacturer, but yet there are third-party solutions that were around before people even built GPSs into cameras, or before they even had Wi-Fi cameras to sync with smartphones. There were GPS logging apps out there, and there were ways to record logs with handheld GPS units as well, back in the day. So maybe that's the way forward. The way backward is the way forward, because that sounds great. I love that idea of photographing the QR code at the end to synchronize them.
Yeah. So in the moment while you were saying that, I found it. It is called GPS 4Cam Pro. 4 is the digit 4. So GPS 4Cam. And I forget how much it costs. It's not expensive, but again, it results in either one or more QR code images that are then processed after the fact.
That sounds awesome. I really like the sound of that, because certainly in terms of GPS tagging, all the manufacturers do it differently, and some of them are struggling a bit with it, I find. Some of them are doing it quite well, but others are not. So that sounds like a great solution.
And we'll have a link to that in the show notes on both YouTube and the TWiP page.
Okay, so should we talk about the differences between the models in the range?
Yeah, because, one of the things I realized when you were talking is that I think it's true for Canon and for Nikon, and even for Nikon, that do you say Canon instead of Canon?
Canon, we will now. The Canon.
Right. That for some reason, the number of digits implies lower cost and value. So if you get a camera that just has one digit in the model number, it's a higher quality, and I've never understood why, except it allows them to keep adding digits to go to lower and lower quality. They can't really go in the other direction. So yeah, tell us about the 4-digit Nikons.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there's the 3000s at the entry level, there's the 5000s kind of in the middle, and there's the 7000s at a higher end. All three currently share the same 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. As I mentioned earlier, that is a sensor without the low pass filter. Now, if you're into the way sensors work, believe it or not, well, what happens with a digital sensor is it chops the picture, it samples the picture into finite little squares. But if those little squares are coincidentally matching the distance between very fine details, say maybe roof tiles or fencing, then you can get that wire shimmering effect. So to avoid that, what digital camera sensors do is they actually slightly blur the image using something called a low pass filter. That slightly blurs out that ultimately fine detail so that you reduce the moire. However, the manufacturers found that as resolutions increased and they got higher and higher and higher, this was becoming less of an issue. So they actually experimented with removing the low pass filter to give the sensors a slight boost in resolving power. Now, this sounds like it could actually boost the resolving power significantly, but the fact is low-pass filters have been getting weaker and weaker. So there's not that much difference from some manufacturers, but Nikon was still a pioneer in this respect. They did it some time ago, and now it's consistent across their 4-digit range. So they all lack a low-pass filter. They're all 24 megapixel. They're all APS-C. So they're all delivering essentially the same quality given the same lens. Normally, where these ranges could differ would be in continuous shooting speed. However, the 3300 and the 5500 both share 5 frames per second. And I thought, since we're listening, that I would actually let you hear what the shutter sounds like. I'm going to try and fire off a burst here. Did you hear that?
Well, I did.
Wow, that's fantastic. So that is the 5500 shooting at its top speed of about 5 frames per second. The D7200 shoots fractionally faster, only at 6 frames per second, although you can boost that with the battery grip, I think maybe to 7. I'm a little hesitant to be absolutely correct with that because I have not reviewed the 7200 yet. It's a brand new product, and it's one that we will obviously cover on this show in the future. So if they don't differ in quality or continuous shooting speed, where do they differ? Well, they differ in things like controls, design, build, especially viewfinder. Now, the viewfinder in the D5500 and the D3300 uses a mirror, a pentamirror, and it has a relatively small image that comes out the back. The D7200 is a pentaprism system. This means it's got a big chunk of glass in the head rather than the mirror. That makes it heavier, it makes it bigger, but it also allows it to deliver a larger and brighter view through the viewfinder. So the viewfinder is better on the higher end model. Small things like auto exposure bracketing, not available at all on the D3300, available here in 3 frames. And on the 7200, I think it's either 7 or 9 frames. The autofocus system, as I recall, an 11-point AF system on the 3300, a 39-point on the 5500, and a 51-point on the D7200. Although I think more importantly than those numbers, the D7200 sensor now lets it autofocus in lower light conditions. And I think going forward, it's these things that really make the difference, because when DSLRs were the only cameras around, if you were into a higher end product, the AF system, or the number of AF points, was actually a differentiator. Do you remember when you would actually go into a shop and say, how many megapixels does it have? Okay, how many AF points does it have? Because that's obviously a differentiator we can talk about. And it's something where Canon and Nikon always kind of differed. And then as people got more sophisticated, they would learn that some of those were more sensitive AF points than others. They were cross-type sensors, double cross-type. Maybe they were more sensitive in lower light conditions. But then mirrorless cameras came along and kind of spoiled that party a bit, because they could focus anywhere on the frame, not just in this golden diamond in the middle. And for me, that's kind of made the number of AF points a little bit moot, a little bit slightly redundant, depending on how you shoot. So there are other reasons why you might go for these cameras, but it's generally kind of like the grip, the handling, the controls, the bracketing, the AF points. Most importantly of all, the viewfinder. The D7200 has got 2 SD memory card slots, so it can record a backup at the same time, or JPEG to one and RAW to another. Little differences like this to kind of upsell you as you go throughout the range.
When I had a D7000 camera a number of years ago when that first came out, one of the things that attracted me to that model was that I could use my old Nikon lenses with it, ones that didn't have a motor in it for autofocus. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the 7000 had an autofocus motor. And that's another difference, isn't it, between that and some of these other models?
Yes, that's right. The 7200, I believe, still retains that autofocusing motor. So if you have older AFD lenses, they will autofocus without, whereas on the D5000 series and the D3000 series, they took that out to save money. And also because they thought that most of the people who would buy these cameras would be pairing them with more modern AFS lenses. So if you have an AFS lens, such as pretty much any zoom or in fact, any lens that they've made recently, then they will autofocus. The really interesting thing, though, about the differences in Nikon's range is that it's not necessarily just a case of them getting more and more sophisticated as you go from the 3s to the 5s to the 7s. The 5000 series has got a unique feature which is not available on the 3000 or the 7000. And that is that it is the only model in the range with a fully articulated screen. And if you're watching the video, you can see this screen flips out to the side. It's side hinged like the Panasonic mirrorless cameras. I think that's the best way of doing it. And it can flip round to face the subject for self-portrait. So if you're filming pieces to camera, and it allows you to angle it down to shoot at high angles, or angle it up like this to shoot at waist level. I really like shooting with the camera held low this way. And something that makes this even more unique, because there's only 2 DSLRs in Nikon's range that have an articulated screen. There's the D5500 and the D750, which is their mid-range full-frame DSLR. But the D5500 is the only one with a touch screen, and this is its big new feature over its predecessor. And if I point that at me, wow, you can see me on the screen. If I try and angle that so we don't have any reflection, you can see I can tap the screen and hopefully, do you see the AF area move?
Yes, you can barely make it out, especially if I stop talking.
Well, you can touch it anyway. Believe me, you can touch control this and move the AF area by touch, and also touch your way through some of the controls here. This is quite difficult to do backwards, but you can see. Oh no, you can see that I'm in live view now, and I can tap my way between some of these settings. There you go. Quite difficult to do with the camera held away from you while you're doing a hangout, but you get the idea. So that is a new thing on the D5500, and it's unique in the range. So that is a feature that this camera has that the D7200 does not have.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I find fully articulating LCDs good for is shooting video. For some reason, I can't explain it. It seems highly appropriate for video. Is this camera otherwise pretty good for video compared to others?
Yeah, I mean, the video quality is good. There's some scaling artifacts because they use a non-integer scaling factor which means they don't divide it by 1 or 2 or 3 or anything like that when they're scaling it down to 1080p. But the video quality is quite good. The biggest problem for me in terms of video, and this will bring us on to what Canon are doing with their latest models, is that at a consumer level, it does not continuously autofocus very effectively. It uses a contrast-based autofocusing system, which, as you know, has to focus beyond a target to know that it's gone too far and then pull back. That process of going back and forth is called hunting or searching. And it's okay if you're doing stills, but when you're doing video, it's very distracting. It's also not a continuous process. So what happens in a camera like this is it gives the illusion of continuous autofocusing by performing that contrast-based adjustment on a regular basis. So it will go, let's just check. Are we still in focus? No, we're not in focus. Quick, focus forward. No, go back a bit. Right now in focus. Oh no, we're not in focus. He's moved. The subject's moved. Let's do it again. Let's go forward a bit. No, let's go back a bit. And what makes it even worse is that the autofocusing motors in Nikon's lenses are quite noisy. So what happens during this process, in fact, you know what? As I talk, I'm going to try and set this up so you can hear it. So what happens is the autofocusing motor is really, really noisy, and you hear it going zip, 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 as it goes back and forth the whole time. And that could be really very, very distracting. I'm not able to set this up at the moment. You can't quite hear it. But if you go to cameralabs.com, where I've done a full review of this camera, I've got some examples where the continuous autofocus is enabled for the video. And you'll hear it going zip, 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 zip the whole time. And it is a bit distracting and visually distracting because you see it hunting. And this is something that Canon have resolved by embedding phase detect AF points on their sensors. And that allows them to not only, well, that first of all allows them to focus very confidently. So phase detect AF systems know what direction they have to focus in and know when they have to stop. But Canon has also developed a series of lenses with STM focusing motors, that's Canon's terminology for it, which allows those lenses to focus very, very quietly and smoothly. So when you've got a lens that focuses quietly and confidently, you have a much nicer continuous autofocus experience for movies. And that, for me, is an area where Nikon is lacking. And it's a shame because, like you say, the fully articulated screen makes the D5500 ideal for filming video. But if you want a camera that can continuous autofocus while you film, I prefer Canon's technology.
So that raises two questions for me. One is, can that be solved with this camera by using an external microphone? Isn't that generally a good idea anyway? Will this camera allow me to do that?
Well, there's two issues, Doug. One is the sound of the lens focusing, which is resolved by either using a quieter lens or, as you say, by moving the microphone further away from the lens, or indeed ignoring the audio at all and replacing it with music later on, or getting your friends and family to dub it later on while they watch it. But that still doesn't solve the problem of the visual hunting. This is a contrast-based system, so you still see that picture going in and out of focus as it checks. If you're just repositioning the camera, and again, I've got examples of this in my review, it's not too bad. If you go from here and then you pan across to something else, the kind of focusing rack isn't too distracting. But if your subject is moving or the camera is moving like this, maybe towards the subject or away, then it's not very effective.
Now, how about if your subject is standing still? Does the camera still hunt if you're in continuous autofocus mode?
Yes, it can, which can be very frustrating. If it's not 100% sure, or sometimes it just thinks, you know what, I'm just going to check. I'm just going to check again. So I find when I'm recording video with the Nikons, I generally switch the autofocus off and focus manually, because at least you know that it's not going to hunt back and forth constantly the whole time.
Now, is this unique to the Nikons, or is it true of any contrast-based continuous autofocus system, even in mirrorless cameras that don't have phase detection?
Yeah, so in the mirrorless world, an awful lot of companies are now embedding phase detect AF points, which allows them to continuously autofocus better for stills and for movies. Fujifilm's doing it, but just in the middle on models like the X-T1, and that works very well so long as you're focusing in the middle. Sony, as we've discussed many, many times before, nailed it with the A6000 and has inherited that on the A5100. The Nikon One system has always had it and does it very, very well. Canon's EOS M3 has it and does it well. The only two models that really don't have it or don't do it so well are the Micro Four Thirds models from Panasonic and Olympus. Now, Olympus did embed phase detect points on the EM1, but they didn't seem to work that well in my test with Micro Four Thirds lenses. They were there more to offer better legacy support for older 4/3 lenses. So really, Olympus and Panasonic still employ a mostly or entirely contrast-based AF system for movies. Now, the thing is they've really accelerated their focusing. It goes very, very fast, and all of their lenses are very, very quiet, or most of them are quiet. So they avoid the noise issue. In terms of speed, they're very, very quick, but they still hunt a little bit. So that is an issue if you're filming video with those, but they are much better. That experience is much better than the one you get with models like the D5500. And again, I've got sample videos that show all of that. So, you know, if you're into continuous AF, I think for movies, Canon and Sony have got the best technologies at the moment.
Okay, now I read your review on cameralabs.com, which of course is the ultimate source for anybody who wants to know all about this camera or any other. We encourage everyone to go to cameralabs.com and read everything you ever wanted to know and more about these cameras. But from there, I know that you were testing this with one of the kit lenses. Tell us about, you know, the optical quality of these lenses and how it works with this camera.
Well, the first thing I want to show about this lens, the kit zoom, which is an 18 to 55 millimeter, as they all seem to be, it's a collapsing zoom. You'll notice on the barrel, if you're watching the video, it's got an L position. This is the locked position, and it's got a big button here, and you need to twist it for it to work. You see, I had to do that manually. That wasn't a motorized process. Now it's at the 18 millimeter position, and then I can twist it to the 55 millimeter position. So what this does is really save you about an inch, maybe an inch and a half on the length. In terms of quality, I found this lens was okay, but the interesting thing is, because remember, this is a 24 megapixel camera, if you compare it to 16 megapixel models, say Micro Four Thirds models or Fujifilm X series models, I didn't find that this camera resolved significantly greater detail with the kit zoom. You'd think it would because it has 50% more megapixels, but it is very much dependent on the optics, because that is a lot of pixels that you're packing on that sensor, and you need very, very good quality glass and lenses to be able to resolve that amount of detail onto that finer pixel pitch. So I found if you're using this kit zoom, there is really not a great deal of resolution benefit between this and a 60 megapixel model. And that's really important because I think a lot of people pick cameras based on their resolution, even if deep down they might think, well, I'm not even going to use that resolution in practice. You know, I'm not going to make a massive print or a massive crop. But what they may not realize is that the lens is actually letting them down. And Sony's the same. It wouldn't be an all about the gear show if I didn't hold up my A6000. And I'm going to show this compared to the D5500 in a minute. But the kit zoom on this as well is not very good quality. They've really gone for something that's very small, but it is compromised in terms of quality. If you want the best resolution, if you want to see 24 megapixels worth of resolution out of either the Sony or the Nikon bodies, you really need to get rid of these kit zooms and fit something else. But you know what, Doug? I'm holding them both up at the moment, so let's just go for that comparison here.
Do it.
I'm going to do it. I don't care. Okay, so for those listening on the podcast, I'm holding up both cameras at the moment, and it's pretty evident that the Sony mirrorless kit, the A6000, is considerably smaller. The body is a lot thinner, but the kit zoom is also about half the thickness. So even though neither of them are fantastic quality, I'm going to peek my face in the middle. See that? Sandwiched by a DSLR and a mirrorless camera. I tell you what, if you're listening on the podcast, you're really missing out here. Check out the video. So this is obviously a much smaller camera, the A6000. So this is one of the things you have to think about. Do you want to start talking about why you'd want to go for a DSLR at this end of the market versus a mirrorless camera?
Yeah, why would you?
That's a great question, Doug. I'm glad you asked me that.
Gordon, wait, why would you want to go for a DSLR versus a mirrorless camera at this end of the market?
Well, it is an interesting question. And a lot of it these days boils down to which style you prefer. It really does boil a lot down to looks and feel. DSLRs, because they have to house a mirror, are physically bigger than mirrorless cameras. this means you need more space in your bag. A mirrorless camera, as you've just seen on the video, the A6000 and any other mirrorless camera is a lot smaller. It will fit in a smaller bag. And if you're hiking or you want to travel light, that's a big benefit. However, if you've got big hands or you want a camera that's more comfortable to hold, a DSLR is almost inevitably going to be more comfortable, a bigger camera. So a lot has to do with how this thing feels in your hands. Then you've got to look at composition. Now, in the old days, it would have been a very simple comparison because you would compose with the optical viewfinder on a DSLR and you would compose with the screen on a mirrorless camera. But then they started putting electronic viewfinders on mirrorless cameras, and they started putting live view on DSLRs. So you can now compose with the screen on a DSLR in live view, and you can compose with a viewfinder on a mirrorless camera. So they're kind of meeting a bit, but there are big pros and cons between both of those technologies. Now, live view on a DSLR, on a Nikon DSLR, is quite a different experience to shooting through the viewfinder. You get 100% coverage on the screen. You get to preview effects. That's the same with all live view systems. But the focusing is not as quick or responsive as focusing through the viewfinder. And this puts a lot of DSLR owners off going for mirrorless because they go, wait a minute, a mirrorless camera does not have an optical viewfinder. Therefore, it's hobbled by this slow AF system. But that's not the case. Mirrorless cameras that are natively live view have very, very fast autofocusing systems, even though they're composing electronically. It's just that DSLRs haven't really been able to match that experience as well. Canon is the exception here. They're delivering quite a nice live view experience now with quite swift autofocusing. So then you think, well, let's have a look at the viewfinders. What are the differences here? Now, a DSLR has got an optical viewfinder. This is literally taking the light through the lens. It bounces off a mirror or bounces off the mirror inside, off another mirror in the head, or through the pentaprism comes out the back. This is actually working at the speed of light, which means if you're following action, like a racehorse or a car or a cyclist or something zooms past, there is no lag. There is no, the picture, what you see is actually what's happening because you're being limited by the speed of light, which fortunately is very fast when you're dealing with short distances. You know, it's essentially instant. So if you're doing a lot of this and panning to follow action, then an optical viewfinder works very, very well because there's no lag. Now, an electronic viewfinder, the way it would work on a camera like this, which has a built-in viewfinder, this is a mirrorless camera, the way it works there is it has to take the light that hits the sensor, it has to process that, it has to demosaic it, it has to generate a color image, and then send it to the viewfinder. Now, as processors get faster and faster, that process takes place pretty quickly, but it's not instant. It's not as fast as an optical viewfinder. So if you are panning from left to right, there is a slight delay, and that can be a problem if you're, say, following a tennis player or a football player who isn't moving at a regular speed or direction. They might dodge back and forth, and that's very hard to follow them with a mirrorless camera because you've got to kind of try and anticipate what happens next, whereas with an optical finder, it's much easier. Also, in low light, what an electronic viewfinder has to do is turn up the amplifier, turn up the gain, and that can produce a noisier image. With an optical viewfinder, it's optical. It uses the available light. It does not become noisier. And it's these two things that have led many people, DSLR users, traditional users, to conclude that optical viewfinders are better. But it's not a one-sided story because an electronic viewfinder can do so much more. First of all, they all offer 100% coverage. Now, on a DSLR at this level, this viewfinder on the D5500 is not giving you 100% coverage. You need to go to the D7200 for that. This is giving a slightly cropped coverage. So when you look at your pictures, there's slightly more around the edges than you saw when you were composing the picture. An electronic viewfinder can give you preview lots of effects. Now you might think, I don't use effects. However, you can preview things like white balance, which is very useful. There are no surprises when you're shooting with an electronic viewfinder. What you see is literally what you get. You can overlay any number of guides, like not just an alignment grid, but things like a live histogram, various leveling gauges. You can do a massive amount. If you're composing for video, you can't do that with an optical viewfinder. You can with an electronic viewfinder. So if you're composing your video or filming your video, you can do it with the camera held to your eye. You can also play back images or videos with an electronic viewfinder. But probably the biggest difference, and the first difference you'll notice when you're switching from one of these cameras, a DSLR, an entry-level DSLR, to even an entry-level mirrorless camera, is the size of the viewfinder image. The fact is, on these entry-level DSLRs, the viewfinder image is fairly small. Not only is it not 100% coverage, it's quite a small image. It's like you're looking through a tunnel. But on a camera like, say, the A6000 or a mid-range mirrorless, a mirrorless camera costing roughly the same, the viewfinder image is much larger, much more immersive. And to me, that makes it a more enjoyable experience overall. Magnified assistance, focus peaking, things like that. You can do all of those things with an electronic viewfinder, which you can't with an optical viewfinder. So there's pros and cons to both. And while I was describing that, if you went, yeah, that sounds like me, when he was talking about those guides and things like that, then you should be thinking about an electronic viewfinder and a mirrorless camera. However, if you're thinking, no, that was me when he was talking about panning and following the action or shooting in low light, then go for an optical viewfinder on a DSLR. So these are the real differences you have to weigh up now.
Yeah, I think if you look back 2 years ago, a little more, when we were talking more about mirrorless cameras as being new, we emphasize size and weight. We were saying, oh, it's so great. You can go out with a much smaller kit. Everything about them is smaller and lighter. But what's happened, as you say, is that the mirrorless cameras those manufacturers have put so much into making up for whatever deficiencies that they had compared to a DSLR, that those cameras are virtually as capable as a DSLR today, except perhaps for the very high-end DSLRs. Likewise, the DSLR vendors have done things like articulating screens, touch screens, live view to try and make up for what are now their deficiencies. But my impression is that the DSLR approach it's a losing battle, that the ability of the mirrorless cameras to catch up far exceeds what the DSLRs are even capable of doing and going in the opposite direction. Is that your sense too?
Yeah, so the big advantage of a DSLR over a mirrorless camera is the optical viewfinder. And for me, the optical viewfinder, if it's very small and not giving 100% coverage, then I'm not getting the full benefit of that technology. So I think DSLRs only really come into their own now at a higher level. And I'm talking at the 7000 series or higher. That's where they're giving 100% coverage and a nice big pentaprism view. I mean, if you shoot with something like a D750 or a D810, that's gorgeous. That optical viewfinder looks great, but that is a world apart from the viewfinder you get on an entry-level DSLR. So I think at this end of the market, it's very tough for Canon and Nikon to compete against mirrorless cameras costing roughly the same price. Because if you look through those viewfinders, you'll go, wow, that electronic viewfinder is so huge on the mirrorless camera, and look at all those other things I can do, and things that you should take for granted, like why should I have to choose between the viewfinder and the screen if I'm filming a movie? The DSLR forces me to do that, but the mirrorless camera doesn't. It says, no, we don't mind. You can do it either way around. If you're used to shooting with a screen, if you're coming from a point and shoot camera or a smartphone, then you're used to holding a camera out in front of you. So therefore, a mirrorless camera would be the natural progression. If you hand a DSLR to somebody who's used to using a point and shoot or a phone, they will inevitably hold it in front of them. They're composing with the screen. So if you're composing with the screen, you want the camera that gives you the best screen composition experience. And for me, mirrorless models, whether they're from Panasonic, Olympus, Sony, Fujifilm, whoever, they're delivering a better screen-based, better live view composition experience than Nikon is on its entry-level DSLRs. Like I said, Canon's slightly different because they've got a better live view autofocusing system. So their live view experience is still quite nice, but it's still not a native. It's still not a one. It's not the only technology, is what I'm trying to say. With mirrorless, it's only live view, so they've got to make it good. It's got to work. The AF has to be good, and of course, the AF when you're in live view works anywhere on the screen. So when you couple an AF system that can focus on anything on the screen and quickly, as it does with native mirrorless cameras, then you've got a really compelling experience. And if you turn on things like face detection, and you're able to just focus on a face regardless of where it is on the screen, that to me makes these entry-level mirrorless cameras very, very compelling compared to entry-level DSLRs. Because on the entry-level DSLR, you can have face detection, but you need to be in live view, and the live view experience isn't normally that great. So if you want the better AF experience, you switch to the optical viewfinder. Suddenly your autofocusing is much better, but it's limited to that area in the middle. What if the person is off center? Then you've got to point at them, lock the focus, recompose. That can work, but with higher resolution cameras, I'm noticing more opportunity for focusing errors. In fact, only last night I was shooting with Canon's EOS 5DS and 5DSR, which are 50 megapixel cameras. And we were doing some portraits, and somebody took my portrait using that technique where we'd locked the AF area to the middle. They recomposed it after pointing at my eye. And I'm only talking about an f4 lens at 70mm. This wasn't a very shallow depth of field lens. But by the time it had moved back, my eye was slightly out of focus. And that was quite clear on the 50 megapixel sensor. So as resolutions increase, you've got to be very careful with your technique. And that's when, when I'm taking pictures with mirrorless cameras with good face detection. I mean, look at Olympus and Sony, what they've done on some of their latest models. Not only do they have face detection, they have eye detection. And it can focus not just on the eyes, but the closest eye in the composition. And it just works so well. And it happens so quickly. But that, to me, and for a lot of people, that's what they want a camera for, to take pictures of their friends and family when they're on a holiday, their kids growing up. They don't want to worry about what technology they should be using. They just want the thing that focuses successfully and quickly on their subject.
I'm waiting for eyelash detection. Closest eyelash detection. We'll get
well,
that.
Actually, Doug, the eyelash is an interesting question, because when you have an ultra shallow depth of field, do you want the eyeball or the eyelash in focus?
There you go.
What's your preference? What is your preference?
It depends on the person entirely. I just posted an image I shot with Leica M6 in a dark setting, wide open f2.8 of Frederick Van Johnson. I think you saw that picture, good old Frederick. And for Frederick, it was the eyes. I didn't worry about the eyelashes with Frederick. But there are some people who are more beautiful than Frederick. I know that's hard to believe, but there are some.
I don't believe that. Frederick has amazing eyelashes. Anyway,
there are people with actually more impressive eyelashes than Frederick. And anyway, to wrap this up, the one thing we didn't talk about is the pricing. I'm just going to go to my notes for a second. I'm going to do this in US dollars just because it's easy for me. This camera, body only, is $750. For another $100, you can get it with that kit lens that Gordon says he doesn't like. That's the 18-55 zoom. You can get an 18-140 zoom with this camera, which I believe is a better lens. That's going to cost you a little over $1,000 US, though. So there's a big bump between the 18-55 kit and the 18-140 kit.
And interestingly, Doug, once you get up to that 18-140 kit, the price is very similar to the D7200 body alone. And that's how it works, you see, because when you've got that mindset, you think, oh, wait a minute, maybe I should go for the 7200 body instead.
Well, the 7200 is around $1,200 for the body only. So with or without the lens, apples to apples, you're going to spend about $450 more for that 7200. Either way, though, as you say, you're getting up to the point where on a logarithmic scale, the prices are converging, certainly. But a couple of things that people should think about. One is that the 5300, which is the predecessor to this D5500, is still available for about $100 less. So if you don't need the LCD that articulates, you might consider that.
Actually, Doug, the LCD does articulate on the D5300. What it doesn't do, it doesn't have the touch sensitive aspect.
Okay.
But remember, the 5300 has the built-in GPS receiver.
That's true.
So it could be a bit of a bargain. It's very well worth keeping your eye on prices on the 5300, especially as it's closer to the 3300. So if you were thinking of that, it's not that big a reach to go to the 53.
Yeah, and you were pointing out that these cameras have essentially the same image quality. The 3300 is, I don't believe it's made any longer, but you can, for only $350, you can get one refurbished by Nikon. So now you're getting a camera that's actually $400 less than that. So here's your entry-level Nikon, real entry-level, at $350 body only for a refurbished Nikon. And those are going to be around, I think, for quite a while. Maybe they still make them, because I have a note here that you can get one new for $500, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw just before we started the show, I looked it up, and I think I saw the body for about $500. with the 18-55 zoom. I should also note that if anyone is listening or watching from the UK, the D5500 kit with the 18-55 is about £650. So that's the price that you'll be looking at there. But again, there are similar crossovers. By the time you add the more expensive kit zoom, you're getting quite close to a 7200 body. But again, you know, there's a whole world outside of these three Nikon cameras. You know,
well, that's what I was going to say. You know, you've compared it to the Sony a6000, which is a camera that both you and I own. I believe you own that one. Love it very much. Terrific bargain at $450 for the body alone. Now, there's rumor that the A6000 is going to be upgraded very shortly. I'm excited about that to see what Sony's going to do with that. But regardless, for $300 less than this Nikon D5500 that Sony is out there, same size sensor, same resolution sensor, 11 frames a second, remarkable camera, regardless of price. But when you consider the price, it's amazing. But talk to us about some of the Canon competition to this.
Well, in Canon's range, you would probably be going up against a newish model that they call, outside of North America, they call the 750D. In North America, you call it the T6i. That's a Rebel. Canon have taken a really interesting approach with this camera. Now, they offer a slightly upgraded version of it as well. You call it the T6S, we call it the 760D. They're identical, apart from the higher end one has got a little LCD screen on the top. It's got a control wheel on the back, and it has a sensor that switches the screen off when you bring the camera to your eye. That's about the only difference between them. In the UK, there's about a £50 difference, so I'd expect maybe $80 or approximately $80 difference in the US. Quite similar in spec, actually, to the D5500. Canon has finally developed a 24 megapixel sensor, so they're the same resolution. It's the same sensor, I believe, as in the EOS M3, so we already know what the quality is going to look like. If you look at my EOS M3 review at Camera Labs, you can see some pictures from that, albeit with a different kit zoom. Fully articulated screen, touch sensitive, you know, similar optical viewfinder size. For me, the big difference between them is their live view and movie experience. Canon has got a hybrid AF system, which embeds phase detect AF points. This allows it to do the confident focus pulling that I was describing earlier, where it doesn't hunt back and forth. Also, the kit zooms have got Canon's quiet STM focusing motor. So if you do a lot of movie shooting with continuous auto focusing, I think the Canons are a better bet. But then, you know, it's not a one-sided argument. Nikon, the D5500 has got things like an intervalometer built into it, so you can do time-lapse shooting within the camera without any extra accessories. So there's lots of little features that you've got to weigh up. But that would be its big competition. And they're, of course, both traditional DSLRs. We will be doing a show about the T6i and T6S. Don't worry. I was shooting with them both last night. The interesting thing is that Canon keeps saying to me, they're like, look at the control difference. Look at the control difference between these two bodies. And you're like, yeah, but, you know, they're essentially the same camera. Then you pick them up and start using them, and it's like, whoa, actually, you know, they really do feel very different. And for me, it's a very successful upsell. I would buy the T6S over the T6i, or rather, from where I am, the 750D over the 760D over the 750D. It's only a little bit extra, but I don't think I'd use the top screen that much, but I certainly prefer the positioning of the controls, and that you have a control wheel on the higher end model, whereas you're using the little cross keys on the back of the lower end one. So I think that's going to be a successful model for them.
I did check this earlier. The 750D, as you call it, and what's the US model number for that?
T6i, Rebel T6i.
T6i. That camera is $750 in the US. So it's exactly the same price, body only, as this D5500 reviewing. So there's a head-to-head shootout right there between the two. And it sounds like I'm not going to get you to commit to one or the other between the Nikon and the Canon. It looks like each has its own advantages. Is that right?
Definitely. But if you're filming movies and want continuous autofocus, or if you're shooting a lot in live view and you're using continuous autofocus, then the Canon will deliver a better experience because it has a better live view and movie AF system. Definitely better. Okay,
so the final question that we usually get to on All About the Gear is, who is this camera for? I mean, is it, if I'm shooting something like D7200, D7000, would I buy this as a second body, as a backup? Is it purely entry level? I mean, for whom would you recommend this camera?
Well, when you look at entry-level cameras, they're really aimed at people who are upgrading from either a point and shoot or a phone, and they want better quality, better control, greater sophistication. They want to develop their photography hobby. So they go in and they look at the entry-level model and they go, yeah, that's definitely going to give me way better quality than I'm getting with my phone or a point and shoot. But since I'm committing to carrying a bigger product and spending a few $100 or pounds, then why don't I make an even bigger step and go up to, you know, a model that's even beyond that? So that's who it's aimed at. It's aimed at people who are buying their first serious camera, if you like. I don't like using the word serious because it's like you've got to stop having fun with photography. Now it's serious. You're not allowed to smile with a serious camera. You've got to look very stern and deliberate. So it's your first sophisticated camera or high quality camera. So it's still an entry level model. I can't really foresee many entry-level DSLR owners, say if you've got a 3000 series or a cheaper Rebel and you're switching, I can't see them upgrading to it. It's not a big enough step, really. They would probably skip that and go onto the 7000 series or think, you know what, I might try one of these newfangled mirrorless cameras instead. So it's aimed at people, I think, who are buying their first sophisticated camera. And it's very nice. You know, I really enjoyed shooting with it, but I kept coming back to this idea that the kind of people who would be using it are the kind of people who are probably most used to shooting with the screen, either with their phone or a point and shoot. And if you're shooting with the screen, which is in a live view situation on one of these cameras, then which type of camera gives you a better live view experience? In the DSLR world, the Canons give a better live view experience. But then in the whole camera world, mirrorless cameras give a better live view experience overall. So I keep coming back to those mirrorless cameras. And I think DSLRs are certainly compelling at a high end if you're into sports or very low light photography. But at a kind of entry level, for me personally, they're becoming less compelling. Unless you physically just love the way they look and feel, and you really want that optical viewfinder, even though it is small and not giving 100% coverage.
Very good. You know, as soon as you talked about having fun with a DSLR, all I could think of was some really large DSL, like a 1D or a Nikon D4 at the end of a selfie stick. Right?
Yeah.
It would have to be the strength of a baseball bat or something for this to work, right? But here you are holding this monstrous camera out to take a picture of yourself. And so that was my idea of fun with the DSLR.
Again, yeah. So I'm going to interrupt you there, Doug, because you thought you'd finished the show, but no, there's a bonus minute coming up. So yes, you can articulate the screen on the D5500. That's its big selling point. You can turn it around, do selfies. It's touch sensitive, but ultimately, do you want to hold this camera out in front of you for a self-portrait? It is much easier to do that with a smaller, lighter camera. So if that is the driving force, if you were choosing this camera because it's better for selfies, then maybe there is a better technology for you out there.
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll get to the point where people are really only buying DSLRs either at the high end because they really need that capability, or as my niece said when she turned, I think it was 16, she said, "Uncle Doug, can you help me find a camera with a twisty lens?" She wanted to look like a photographer, so she wanted a twisty lens camera.
She wanted a serious camera.
She wanted to look serious.
So what did she get? What camera did you recommend?
I gave her my old Nikon D40.
That showed her.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Didn't that have, now that has, some people really love that camera because didn't it have something like a 500th of a second flash sync? Was it the D40 that did that?
It might have. The reason I regret giving it to her is that's a camera that I would have done an infrared conversion on. That's one of the most popular cameras for making into an infrared camera. I would probably only use it once or twice, but in any case, she has put it to good use. She's a very good photographer now.
Excellent.
All right, Gordon, thanks very much. Again, I want everybody to go to cameralabs.com where you'll see a much more in-depth review of this camera. You'll see Gordon doing some video tests. You'll see him do something interesting. The camera has an HDR option. See how that works. Also, like I said, video. I think you shot with an 85 millimeter on there as well, I believe, something like that. Is that right?
It was a while ago. I tested it. I think I'd mostly tested it with the 18-55 on the D5500.
Yeah, there was something. You had one other lens, I think. And of course, if you're interested in
the 50, it was the 50. I think
50,
I did some
that's what
tests with the 51.8G.
Right. And if you're interested in purchasing a D5500 or any other cameras that we review here on All About the Gear, also head over to cameralabs.com and click on the buy links there. It helps pay the bills. Gordon, thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of All About the Gear.
Thank you. Bye-bye.